Hello everyone, this is Brian from Chess Fanatic, here with another video. Today I'm going to analyze a very interesting game played in 1993 between two very strong Grandmasters, Alex Yermolinsky and Gregory Kaidanov. Yermolinsky is a very strong chess American Grandmaster with a peak of 2699, tied as the U.S. chess champion in 1993 and became sole U.S. chess champion in 1996. Kaidanov is a Soviet-born American chess grandmaster who teaches for the United States Chess School, and he has a peak rating of 2646, so both very strong players. And Kaidanov was also inducted into the United States Chess Hall of Fame in 2013. Okay, so let's get into the game. In this game, Alex Yermolinsky has the white pieces, and Gregory Kaidanov has the black pieces. So we have d4, d5, c4, e6. This is looking like a Queen's Gambit declined game. Now we have knight f3, knight f6, knight c3, c6. This transposes into the Semi-Slav. Now Yermolinsky decides to play bishop g5, which allows black to go into a very complicated opening. In this position, I used to play bishop g5, but after learning about the sideline that comes up, that actually comes up in this game, I decided to switch to the more modest e3, which blocks the dark squared bishop in, but also avoids complications. Okay, so after bishop g5, if we assume something like bishop e7 is played, then just e3, and this is going to be a normal semi-Slav. However, white is happy because the dark squared bishop is outside of the pawn chain, which is always good. So instead we have g takes c4, which this complicates the position, and Kaidanov played that, and now we have e4, which is, this is basically the only move. If you play something else, you're not going to get as much of an advantage. And the reason why e4 is good is because it not only prepares e5, which looks good, this knight is pinned to the queen, but it also attacks c4. So if black were to play something like bishop e7, just bishop takes c4 gives white a very comfortable position, in which he has the center and active pieces. You can notice that white has 4 pieces out, while black has 2 pieces out, so this is very good. So instead, after e4, we have b5, and after b5, the position becomes more complicated. So now we have e5, which is not the only move, but definitely the most played move by far. h6. This tries to push off the bishop. You notice if this knight cannot move because it's pinned to the queen. If it moves, you're losing the queen. And it's also attacked. So to save a piece, you have to push this bishop away, so that if I were to take, you win my bishop. So h6, bishop h4, backing up, g5, and now if something like bishop g3 was played, black gets a very nice position where he's simply up a pawn after something like knight d5. So instead, we have knight takes g5, h takes g5, and at first look, this looks like you are sacrificing a piece until you realize that this knight on f6 is lost. You can no longer kick away this bishop, and the knight is pinned to the queen while being attacked by a pawn. So this knight is basically lost. So really this was simply a more elaborate trade. Okay, I'm not going to go into theory too much in this position. There's a lot of theory. But basically, black is going to put the bishop on b7. White is going to fianchetto the light-squared bishop. White's going to kingside castle, while black is going to, surprisingly, queenside castle, despite this very open position. And it's basically going to be a very complicated game in which black is attacking the king side and white is attacking the queen side, in which both kings lie. Okay, so here we have knight b to d7, and e takes f6, and now bishop b7. g3, as I said, both ideas, putting the bishop on b7, fianchettoing this bishop. Now queen b6, this is usually where the queen goes to, just preparing for a queenside castle. Now we have bishop g2, queenside castle, and kingside castle. And now this is right about out of the opening, and we have knight e5. And knight e5 is a very strong move that does 3 things. First, it brings brings the knight to white's king side. Again, black is gonna be attacking the king side. But it also puts pressure on the d pawn. Notice that this rook was not attacking this pawn, knight e5, and suddenly this pawn is actually threatened with the queen and rook on this pawn. The third and final thing it does is it brings the knight to d3. Now, obviously you cannot take this knight because you would lose your queen. So in response to this, Yermolinsky decides to take the knight anyways. Now, although a queen is worth more than a knight and a bishop, which is being traded here, knight and a rook, I mean. Notice how white gets the open d file. Some nice pawns, like, for example, one idea in this position is bringing the knight around to win this f7 pawn. And if that f7 pawn falls, then this pawn looks like it might be queening pretty soon. So even though it wasn't a good trade, white gets quite a bit out of it. So we have b4 pushing the knight away, but the knight comes to e4. The knight kind of wants to come to d6 possibly eventually. And queen a5 attacking the a2 pawn. And now we have bishop f4, which is basically preparing the knight to come to g5. Something like queen takes a2 is not possible because knight g5, ignoring all the pawns on the queen side, and simply winning all of the pawns on the king side. And notice how you also get an attack on the king. In this position, for example, there is checkmate threatened. And if, I don't know, something like bishop a6, you can play bishop takes c6, and suddenly checkmate is threatened once again. So bishop f4 is a very good move, and queen takes a2 was not played. Instead, we have c3. Now we have b takes c3 and bishop a6, which is not a very good move. We simply have c takes b4 here. You obviously cannot take the rook because the queen is hanging. It's possible queen takes a2 is what Kaidanov thought, but this actually fails to rook a1, queen c4, rook f to c1, and if you go queen b5, there's this nice idea rook takes c6 check, and if you decide to take, there's knight d6 check, unleashing this bishop onto the queen. So I'm not sure if you missed that or if you simply wanted to play bishop takes b4, believing that this rook is now lost. But here we simply have the move a3. And after a3, white actually has a nice advantage. You cannot take this with the queen, otherwise rook a1 is strong. And taking with the bishop is what was played, but this allows rook f to e1. Okay, after rook f to e1, we have bishop d3, and bishop d3 is a nice move that that simply stops this rook from invading the d file or simply having pressure. You should notice that you obviously cannot take this because the rook on e1 would then be hanging. So instead, knight d6 is played, and here actually rook a1 was better. The idea of rook a1 is to pin this bishop to the queen. It's actually hard to get out of. There's nowhere the queen can really move to get out of this pin while protecting this bishop. For example, if, let's say, queen b4, there is knight d6 check, king b8, and knight takes f7. And as I said before, if this f pawn falls, it's not looking so good for black. So basically, knight d6 check is coming, and this time you wouldn't be able to take it with the bishop. So basically, bishop takes e4 would be forced, after which bishop takes e4, and this is a very comfortable position for white, as you simply have the double bishops, more active pieces. This bishop is pinned, probably something like queen c3 is forced, which doesn't look so great. Okay, so after knight d6 check, however, there's just bishop takes d6, e takes d6, and king d7. So the bishop on d3 is still hanging because the queen still attacks the rook on e1. As I showed before, the rook would be hanging if you were to take the d3. So instead we have rook e5, which is actually not the best move. So rook a1 was a little bit better. Rook e5, the problem is, as Kaidanov played, bishop b5 just equalizes, sort of closes down the position, protects c6. After rook a1, however, there follows queen b6, rook a3, bishop b5, bishop e3, c5, and rook c1. And no material is immediately won, but white has some nice pressure, and if this rook comes over, there may be some pawns that can run on this side. After rook e5, however, there is bishop b5. We have rook c1 and queen a4, unpinning the bishop, as well as adding protection to the c6 pawn. Now we have rook e to c5. Simply putting sort of a nice pressure on this c6 pawn, even though it's quite well protected. We have a6, bishop e5, rook h5, and f4. And this position is actually pretty locked up and equal. Now we have queen to a3, rook 5 to c3, and queen to b4, and then h4. This creates a luft on h2 for the king. In some variations, there's some rook takes e5, and after check, there's not a great place for the king. Now it can come to h2, where it nicely defends g3. So we have h4, and as I said, now there's rook e5, fu5, queen d4 check, and the idea of sacrificing the rook for the bishop on e5 is to trade a rook for a bishop and some pawns, possibly get some nice pawns that can be rolling down the board and gain a nice advantage for black. However, this is still pretty equal because the c6 pawn is very weak. You can notice the bishop and two rooks all on it, so it's hard to win all these pawns without, losing some for yourself. Okay, so we have king h2, queen takes e5, and as I said, bishop takes e6, bishop takes e6, rook takes e6, and queen takes f6. Now we have rook c6 to c2, which was actually not strongest, just because this d6 pawn falls. Yermolinsky correctly realized the, I don't know if there's immediate threat, but there's probably repetition with queen f2 check, or winning the g3 pawn. However, a better move is actually rook 1 to c2. Maybe he was worried about queen f1, but this is simply stronger. You're holding on to this pawn. Okay, so we have rook 6 to c2. And now we have king takes d6 and rook a2. Yeah, it looks pretty tough to protect that a6 pawn. But this still looks pretty equal. We have king e7 because rook takes a6 was going to be with check. But now after king e7, it's tough to take this because of the threat I told you before with queen f2 check. Okay, so after king e7, we have rook c6 instead. And now, let's see, we have queen f1. And although the queen looks pretty scary near the king, it doesn't actually have very much threats. There's not very many checks anywhere, so it really is fine. So after queen f1, we have rook c6 takes a6, king f8, rook b6, king g7, and basically what's happening here is this queen is a little bit annoying. You can't really activate your rooks while the queen is there. This rook is stuck on the second file. So what he's trying to do is bring this rook to the second file, and as seen, kick out the queen. Queen e1, rook a to e2, queen d1, and now rook e5. Just bringing in these rooks, trying to activate them around the king, possibly win one of these pawns. So now here, after queen d7, protecting the f7 pawn, the position is actually relatively equal, slight advantage for white, but instead he went king g7, which is fatal mistake gives white a clear advantage. We have rook g5 check, king f8, and now rook to g6, an excellent move. This does actually two things. You're trying to bring the rook to f6 and win this f7 pawn, but you're also immediately threatening this e6 pawn due to the fact that this pawn is pinned to the king. So we have e5, we have rook g to f6 as I said, and now just e4. There's not a lot to be done about this f7 pawn. If you were to play queen d7, for example, it is too late, as you can simply trade into a winning pawn endgame. So instead we have e4, rook takes f7, king g8, and rook e7. Now simply trying to stop this one passed pawn for black. At this point, the game is pretty much won by Yermolinsky, simply by connecting the rooks behind the black's passed pawn and bringing the king up the board, as we'll see. So we have queen d3, rook f4, threatening this pawn and trying to bring this rook to the e file, e3, rook e4, and these checks don't really do much, as we'll see. Queen c2, king h3, we have queen c8, but these checks are pretty useless with g4, queen c1, rook e3, Kaidanov tries for some more checks, queen h1 check, king g3, queen g1 check, king f4, queen f2 check, king g5, queen d2, king g6, and now Kaidanov resigns, as there are only a few more checks left in the position, which can easily be blocked with rooks, in which case this checkmate is looming, and there's not a lot to be done about it other than sacrificing a queen for a rook, which is very clearly won. So that was the end of the game. This game is a very, very beautiful game played by two very strong American Grandmasters. The game really shows how even in this extremely complicated opening, which I wouldn't dare to play, Yermolinsky and Kaidanov can play pretty accurately. There were only one or two small mistakes. But yeah, pretty good game overall. It also demonstrates the skill of Yermolinsky's technique in the endgame. We had a pretty equal 2 rooks versus a queen and an extra pawn, but he managed to still win it with by activating his rooks. Okay, so thank you all for watching this video, and I hope you enjoyed it.